The falseness and inconsistence of that metaphysical notion of action and agency, which seems to be generally entertained by the defenders of the Arminian doctrine concerning liberty, moral agency, etc. One thing that is made very much a ground of argument and supposed demonstration by Arminians in the defense of the aforementioned principles concerning moral agency, virtue, vice, etc., is their metaphysical notion of agency and action. They say that unless the soul has a self-determining power, it has no power of action. If its volitions be not caused by itself, but are excited and determined by some extrinsic cause, they cannot be the soul's own acts, and that the soul, cannot be active, but must be wholly passive in those effects which it is the subject of necessarily, and not from its own free determination. Mr. Chubb lays the foundation of his scheme of liberty and of his arguments to support it very much in this position, that man is an agent and capable of action, which doubtless is true, but self-determination belongs to his notion of action and is the very essence of it, whence he infers that it is impossible for a man to act and be acted upon in the same thing at the same time, and that no action can be the effect of the action of another. And he insists that a necessary agent, or an agent that is necessarily determined to act, is a plain contradiction. But those are a precarious sort of demonstrations, which men build on the meaning that they arbitrarily affix to a word, especially when that meaning is obtruse, inconsistent, and entirely diverse from the original sense of the word in common speech. That the meaning of the word action, as Mr. Chubb and many others use it, is utterly unintelligible and inconsistent, is manifest because it belongs to their notion of an action, that it is something wherein is no passion or passiveness, that is, according to their sense of passiveness, it is under the power, influence, or action of no cause. And this implies that action has no cause and is no effect. For to be an effect, that's E-F-F-E-C-T, implies passiveness, or the being subject to the power and action of its cause. And yet they hold that the mind's action is the effect of its own determination, yea, the mind's free and voluntary determination, which is the same as saying free choice. So that action is the effect of something preceding, even a preceding act of choice, and consequently in this effect the mind is passive, subject to the power and action of the preceding cause, which is the foregoing choice, and therefore cannot be active. So that here we have this contradiction, that action is always the effect of a foregoing choice, or of foregoing choice, and therefore cannot be action, because it is passive to the power of that preceding causal choice. And the mind cannot be active and passive in the same thing at the same time. Again, they say, necessity is utterly inconsistent with action, and a necessary action is a contradiction. And so, their notion of action implies contingence and excludes all necessity. and therefore their notion of action implies that it has no necessary dependence on or connection with anything foregoing. For such a dependence or connection excludes contingence and implies necessity. And yet their notion of action implies necessity and supposes that it is necessary and cannot be contingent. For they suppose that whatever is properly called action must be determined by the will and free choice. And this is as much as to say that it must be necessary, being dependent upon and determined by something foregoing, namely, a foregoing act of choice. Again, it belongs to their notion of action that it is the beginning of motion or of exertion of power, but yet it is implied in their notion of action that it is not the beginning of motion or exertion of power, but is consequent and dependent on a preceding exertion of power, that is to say, the power of will and choice. For they say there is no proper action but what is freely chosen, or, which is the same thing, determined by a foregoing act of free choice. But if any of them shall see cause to deny this, and say they hold no such thing as that every action is chosen or determined by a foregoing choice, but that the very first exertion of will only, undetermined by any preceding act, is properly called action, well, then I say, such a man's notion of action implies necessity. For what the mind is the subject of, without the determination of its own previous choice, is the subject of necessarily, as to any hand that free choice has in the affair, and without any ability the mind has to prevent it by any will or election of its own, because by the supposition it precludes all previous acts of the will or choice in the case, which might prevent it, so that it is again in this other way implied in their notion of act that it is both necessary and not necessary. Again, it belongs to their notion of an act, that it is no effect of a predetermining bias or preponderation, but springs immediately out of indifference. And this implies that it cannot be from foregoing choice, which is foregoing preponderation. If it be not habitual but occasional, yet if it causes the act, it is truly previous, efficacious, and determining. And yet at the same time, it is essential to their notion of the act that it is what the agent is, the author of freely and voluntarily, and that is by previous choice and design. So that, according to their notion of the act, considered with regard to its consequences, these following things are all essential to it, meaning that it should be necessary and not necessary, that it should be from a cause and no cause, that it should be the fruit of choice and design, and not the fruit of choice and design, that it should be the beginning of motion or exertion, and yet consequent on previous exertion, that it should be before it is, that it should spring immediately out of indifference and equilibrium, and yet be the effect of preponderation, that it should be self-originated and also have its original from something else, that it is what the mind causes itself of its own will and can produce or prevent according to its choice or pleasure, and yet what the mind has no power to prevent, precluding all previous choice in the affair. So that an act, according to their metaphysical notion of it, is something of which there is no idea. It is nothing but a confusion of the mind, excited by words without any distinct meaning, and is an absolute non-entity. And that in two respects. Number one, there is nothing in the world that ever was, is, or can be to answer the things which must belong to its description, according to what they suppose to be essential to it. And number two, there neither is, nor ever was, nor can be any notion or idea to answer the word, as they use and explain it. For if we should suppose any such notion, it would, in many ways, destroy itself. But it is impossible any idea or notion should subsist in the mind, whose very nature and essence, which constitutes it, destroys it. If some learned philosopher who had been abroad in giving an account of the curious observations he had made in his travels should say, quote, he had been in Tierra del Fuego, and there had seen an animal, which he calls by a certain name, that begat and brought forth itself, and yet had a sire and dam distinct from itself, that it had an appetite and was hungry before it had a being, that his master, who led him and governed him at his pleasure, was always governed by him and driven by him where he pleased, that when he moved he always took a step before the first step, that he went with his head first and yet always went tail foremost. And this, though he had neither head nor tail, close quote. Well, it would be no impudence at all to tell such a traveler, though a learned man, that he himself had no notion or idea of such an animal as he gave an account of, and never had, nor ever would have. As the aforementioned notion of action is very inconsistent, so it is wholly diverse from the original meaning of the word. The more usual signification of it in vulgar speech seems to be some motion or exertion of power that is voluntary, or that is the effect of the will, and is used in the same sense as doing, and most commonly it is used to signify outward actions. So thinking is often distinguished from acting, and desiring and willing from doing. Besides this more usual and proper signification of the word action, there are other ways in which the word is used that are less proper, which yet have place in common speech. Oftentimes it is used to signify some motion or alteration in inanimate things with relation to some object and effect. So the spring of a watch is said to act upon the chain and wheels, the sunbeams to act upon plants and trees, and the fire to act upon wood. Sometimes the word is useful to signify motions, alterations, and exertions of power, which are seen in corporeal things, considered absolutely, especially when these motions seem to arise from some internal cause, which is hidden, so that they have a greater resemblance of those motions of our bodies, which are the effects of natural volition, or invisible exertions of will. So the fermentation of liquor, the operations of the lodestone, and of electrical bodies are called the action of these things. And sometimes the word action is used to signify the exercise of thought, or of will and inclination. So, meditating, loving, hating, inclining, disinclining, choosing, and refusing may be sometimes called acting, though more rarely, unless it be by philosophers and metaphysicians, than in any of the other senses. But the word is never used in vulgar speech for the self-determinate exercise of the will, or an exertion of the soul that arises without any necessary connection with anything foregoing. If a man does something voluntarily, or as the effect of his choice, then, in the most proper sense, and as the word is most originally and commonly used, he is said to act. But whether that choice or volition be self-determined or not, whether it be connected with foregoing habitual bias, or whether it be the certain effect of the strongest motive or some intrinsic cause, never comes into consideration in the meaning of the word. And if the word action is arbitrarily used by some men otherwise to suit some scheme of metaphysics or morality, no argument can reasonably be founded on such a use of this term to prove anything but their own pleasure. For divines and philosophers strenuously do urge such arguments, as though they were sufficient to support and demonstrate a whole scheme of moral philosophy and divinity. Well, certainly to erect a mighty edifice on the sand, or rather on a shadow. And though it may now, perhaps through custom, have become natural for them to use the word in this sense, if that may be called a sense or meaning, which is inconsistent with itself, yet this does not prove that it is agreeable to the natural notions men have of things, or that there can be anything in the creation that should answer such a meaning. And though they appeal to experience, yet the truth is that men are so far from experiencing any such thing that it is impossible for them to have any conception of it. If it should be objected that action and passion are doubtless words of a contrary signification, but to suppose that the agent in its action is under the power and influence of something intrinsic is to confound action and passion and make them the same thing. I answer that action and passion are doubtless, as they are sometimes used, words of opposite signification, but not as signifying opposite existences, but only opposite relations. The words cause and effect are terms of opposite signification. But nevertheless, if I assert that the same thing may, at the same time, in different respects and relations, be both cause and effect, well, this will not prove that I confound the terms. The soul may be both active and passive in the same thing in different respects. Active with relation to one thing, and passive with relation to another. The word passion, when set in opposition to action, or rather activeness, is merely a relative. It signifies no effect or cause, nor any proper existence, but is the same with passiveness, or a being passive, or being acted upon by something, which is a mere relation of a thing to some power or force exerted by some cause, producing some effect in it or upon it. And action, when set properly in opposition to passion or passiveness, is no real existence. It is not the same with an action, but is a mere relation. It is the activeness of something on another thing, being the opposite relation to the other. That is, a relation of power or force exerted by some cause towards another thing, which is the subject of the effect of that power. Indeed, the word action is frequently used to signify something not merely relative, but more absolute and a real existence, as when we say an action, when the word is not used transitively, but absolutely for some motion or exercise of body or mind, without any relation to any object or effect. And as used thus, it is not properly the opposite of passion, which ordinarily signifies nothing absolute, but merely the relation of being acted upon. And therefore, if the word action be used in the like relative sense, then action and passion are only two contrary relations. And it is no absurdity to suppose that contrary relations may belong to the same thing at the same time, with respect to different things. So to suppose that there are acts of the soul by which a man voluntarily moves and acts upon objects and produces effects, which yet themselves are effects of something else, and wherein the soul itself is the object of something acting upon and influencing that, do not at all confound action and passion. The words may nevertheless be properly of opposite signification. There may be, as true and real, a difference between acting and being caused to act, though we should suppose the soul to be both in the same volition, as there is between living and being quickened, or to be made alive, or made to live. It is no more a contradiction to suppose that action may be the effect of some other cause besides the agent or being that acts, than to suppose that life may be the effect of some other cause besides the being that lives. What has led men into this inconsistent notion of action when applied to volition, as though it were essential to this internal action, that the agent should be self-determined in it, and that the will should be the cause of it? Well, was probably this, that according to the sense of mankind and the common use of language, it is so with respect to men's external actions, which originally, and according to the vulgar use and most proper sense of the word, are called actions. Men in these are self-directed, self-determined, and their wills are the cause of the motions of their bodies and the external things done, so that unless men do them voluntarily and of choice, and the action be determined by their antecedent volition, it is no action or doing of theirs. And hence, some metaphysicians have been led unwarily, but exceeding absurdly, to suppose the same concerning volition itself, that also must be determined by the will, which is to be determined by antecedent volition, as the motion of the body is, not considering the contradiction it implies. But it is very evident that in the metaphysical distinction between action and passion, though long since become common and the general vogue, due care has not been taken to conform language to the nature of things or to any distinct, clear ideas, as it is in innumerable other philosophical metaphysical terms used in these disputes, which has occasioned inexpressible difficulty, contention, error, and confusion. And thus probably it came to be thought that necessity was inconsistent with action, as these terms are applied to volition. First, these terms, action and necessity, are changed from their original meaning as signifying external voluntary action and constraint, in which meaning they are evidently inconsistent. Constraint to signify quite other things, that is, volition itself and certainty of existence. And when the change of signification is made, care is not taken to make proper allowances and abatements for the difference of sense. But still, the same things are unwarily attributed to action and necessity in the new meaning of the words, which plainly belong to them in their first sense. And on this ground, maxims are established without any real foundation, as though they were in the most certain truths and the most evident dictates of reason. But, however strenuously it is maintained that what is necessary cannot be properly called action, and that a necessary action is a contradiction, yet it is probable there are a few Arminian divines who thoroughly tried, would stand to these principles. They will allow that God is, in the highest sense, an active being, and the highest fountain of life and action. And they would probably not deny that what are called God's acts of righteousness, holiness, and faithfulness are truly and properly God's acts, and God is really a holy agent in them. And yet, I trust, they will not deny that God necessarily acts justly and faithfully, and that it is impossible for him to act unrighteously and unholily. Section 3. The reasons why some think it contrary to common sense to suppose those things which are necessary to be worthy of either praise or blame. It is abundantly affirmed and urged by Arminian writers that it is contrary to common sense and the natural notions and apprehensions of mankind to suppose otherwise than that necessity, that is making no distinction between natural and moral necessity, that necessity is inconsistent with virtue and vice, praise and blame, reward and punishment. And their arguments from hence have been greatly triumphed in, and have been not a little perplexing to many who have been friendly to the truth, as clearly revealed in the Holy Scriptures. It has seemed to them indeed difficult to reconcile Calvinistic doctrines with the notions men commonly have of justice and equity. And the true reasons of it seem to be the following. Roman numeral number 1. It is indeed a very plain dictate of common sense that natural necessity is completely inconsistent with just praise or blame. If men do things which in themselves are very good, fit to be brought to pass, and attended with very happy effects, properly against their wills, or do them from a necessity that is without their wills, or with which their wills have no concern or connection, and then it is a plain dictate of common sense that such doings are none of their virtue, nor have they any moral good in them, and that the persons are not worthy to be rewarded or praised, or at all esteemed, honored, or loved on that account. And on the other hand, that if from like necessity they do those things which in themselves are very unhappy and pernicious, and do them because they cannot help it, well, the necessity is such that it is all one whether they will them or not. And the reason why they are done is from necessity only, and not from their wills. It is a very plain dictate of common sense that they are not at all to blame. There is no vice, fault, or moral evil in all the effect done, nor are they who are thus necessitated in any wise worthy to be punished, hated, or in the least disrespected on that account. In like manner, if things in themselves, good and desirable, are absolutely impossible, with a natural impossibility, the universal reason of mankind teaches that this completely and perfectly excuses persons in their not doing them. And it is also a plain dictate of common sense that if the doing things in themselves good, or avoiding things in themselves evil, is not absolutely impossible with such a natural impossibility, but instead very difficult with a natural difficulty, that is, a difficulty prior to and not at all consisting in will and inclination itself, and which would remain the same, let the inclination be what it will. Then a person's neglect or omission is excused in some measure, though not completely. His sin is less aggravated than if the thing to be done were easy. And if instead of difficulty and hindrance, there be a contrary natural propensity in the state of things to the thing to be done, or effect to be brought to pass, abstracted from any consideration of the inclination of the heart, though the propensity be not so great as to amount to a natural necessity, yet being some approach to it, so that the doing of the good thing be very much from this natural tendency in the state of things, and but little from a good inclination. And then it is a dictate of common sense that there is so much the less virtue in what is done, and so it is less praiseworthy and rewardable. Well, the reason is easy, because such a natural propensity or tendency is an approach to natural necessity, and the greater the propensity, still so much the nearer is the approach to necessity. And therefore, as natural necessity takes away or shuts out all virtue, so this propensity approaches to an abolition of virtue. That is, it diminishes it. And on the other hand, natural difficulty in the state of things is an approach to natural impossibility. And as the latter, that's Latter, when it is complete and absolute, completely takes away blame. So such difficulty takes away some blame or diminishes blame and makes the thing done to be less worthy of the punishment. Roman numeral number 2. Men, in their first use of such phrases as these: must, cannot help it, cannot avoid it, necessary, unable, impossible, unavoidable, irresistible, etc., use them to signify a necessity of constraint or restraint, a natural necessity or impossibility, or some necessity that the will has nothing to do in, which may be, whether men will or no, and which may be supposed to be just the same. Let men's inclinations and desires be what they will. All such kind of terms in their original use, I suppose, among all nations, are relative, carrying in their signification, as was before observed, a reference or respect to some contrary will, desire, or endeavor, which, it is supposed, is or may be the case, or in the case. All men find, and begin to find, in early childhood, that there are innumerable things that cannot be done, which they desire to do, and innumerable things which they are averse to, that must be. Well, they cannot avoid them. They will be, whether they choose them or not. It is to express this necessity, which men so soon and so often find, and which so greatly and early affects them in innumerable cases, that such terms and phrases are first formed. And it is to signify such a necessity that they are first used, and that they are most constantly used in the common affairs of life, and not to signify any such metaphysical, speculative, and abstract notion, as that connection in the nature or course of things which is between the subject and the predicative of a proposition, and which is the foundation of the certain truth of that proposition, to signify which they who employ themselves in philosophical inquiries into the first origin and metaphysical relations and dependencies of things have borrowed these terms, for lack of others. But we grow up from our cradles in a use of such terms and phrases entirely different from this, and carrying a sense exceeding diverse from that in which they are commonly used in the controversy between Arminians and Calvinists. And it being, as was said before, a dictate of the universal sense of mankind, evident to us as soon as we begin to think, that the necessity signified by these terms, in the sense in which we first learn them, does excuse persons and free them from all fault or blame. Hence our idea of excusableness or faultlessness is tied to these terms and phrases by a strong habit, which is begun in childhood as soon as we begin to speak, and it grows up with us and is strengthened by constant use and custom, the connection growing stronger and stronger. The habitual connection, which is in men's minds between blamelessness and those forementioned terms, must, cannot, unable, necessary, impossible, unavoidable, etc., becomes very strong, because as soon as ever men begin to use reason in speech, they have occasion to excuse themselves from the natural necessity signified by these terms in numerous instances. I cannot do it. I could not help it. And all mankind have constant and daily occasion to use such phrases in this sense, to excuse themselves and others in almost all the concerns of life with respect to disappointments and things that happen, which concern and affect ourselves and others, that are hurtful or disagreeable to us or them, or things desirable that we or others fail to obtain. That our being accustomed to an union of different ideas from early childhood makes the habitual connection exceeding strong, as though such connection were owing to nature, is manifest in innumerable instances. It is altogether by such an habitual connection of ideas that men judge of the bigness or distance of the objects of sight from their appearance. Thus it is owing to such a connection early established, and growing up with a person, that he judges a mountain, which he sees at 10 miles distance, to be bigger than his nose, or further off than the end of it. Having been used so long to join a considerable distance and magnitude with such an appearance, men imagine it is by a dictate of natural sense, whereas it would be quite otherwise with one that had his eyes newly opened, who had been born blind. He would have the same visible appearance, but natural sense would dictate no such thing concerning the magnitude or distance of what appeared. Roman numeral number 3. When men, after they had been so habituated to connect ideas of innocency or blamelessness with such terms, that the union seems to be the effect of mere nature, come to hear the same terms used, and then they learn to use them in the forementioned new and metaphysical sense, to signify quite another sort of necessity, which has no such kind of relation to a contrary supposable will and endeavor. The notation of plain and manifest blamelessness by this means is, by a strong prejudice, insensibly and unwarily transferred to a case to which it by no means belongs. The change of the use of the terms to a signification which is very diverse, not being taken notice of or averted to. And there are several reasons why it is not. Roman numeral number 1. The terms, as used by philosophers, are not very distinct and clear in their meaning. Few use them in a fixed, determined sense. On the contrary, their meaning is very vague and confused, which commonly happens to the words used to signify things intellectual and moral, and to express what Mr. Locke calls mixed modes. If men had a clear and distinct understanding of what is intended by these metaphysical terms, they would be able more easily to compare them with their original and common sense, and so would not be so easily led into delusion by words of this sort. Number 2. The change of the signification of the terms is the more insensible, because the things signified, though indeed very different, yet do in some generals agree. In necessity, that which is vulgarly so called, there is a strong connection between the things said to be necessary and something antecedent to it in the order of nature. Also, there's also a philosophical necessity. And though in both kinds of necessity the connection cannot be called by that name with relation to an opposite will or endeavor to which it is superior, which is the case in vulgar necessity, yet in both the connection is prior to will and endeavor, and so in some respect superior. In both kinds of necessity there is a foundation for some certainty of the proposition that affirms the event, the terms used being the same, and the things signified agreeing in these and some other general circumstances, and the expressions as used by philosophers being not well defined, and so of obscure and loose signification. Hence, persons are not aware of the great difference. And the notions of innocence or faultiness, which were so strongly associated with them, and were strictly united in their minds ever since they could remember, remain united with them still, as if the union were altogether natural and necessary. And they that go about to make a separation seem to them to do great violence, even to nature itself. Roman numeral number 4. Another reason why it appears difficult to reconcile it with reason, that men should be blamed for that which is necessary, with a moral necessity, which, as was observed before, is a species of philosophical necessity, is that for lack of due consideration, men inwardly entertain that apprehension, that this necessity may be against men's wills and sincere endeavors. They go away with that notion that men may truly will and wish and strive that it may be otherwise, but that invisible necessity stands in the way. And many think thus concerning themselves. Some wicked men think they wish that they were good, that they love God and holiness, but yet do not find what their wishes produce in the effect. And the reasons why men think so are as follows. Number 1, they find what may be called an indirect willingness to have a better will in the manner before observed. For it is impossible and a contradiction to suppose the will to be directly and properly against itself. And they do not consider that this indirect willingness is entirely a different thing from properly willing what is the duty and virtue required, and that there is no virtue in that sort of willingness which they have. They do not consider that the volitions which a wicked man may have, that he loved God, are no acts of the will at all against the moral evil of not loving God, but only some disagreeable consequences. But the making of the requisite distinction requires more care of reflection and thought than most men are used to. And men, through a prejudice in their own favor, are disposed to think well of their own desires and dispositions, and to account them good and virtuous, though their respect to virtue be only indirect and remote. And it is nothing at all that is virtuous that truly excites or terminates their inclinations. Number 2, another thing that insensibly leads and beguiles men into a superstition that this moral necessity or impossibility is or may be against men's wills and true endeavors is the derivation of the terms often used to express it. I think derivation meant deviation. I don't know about the spelling on it. Such words, for instance, as unable, unavoidable, impossible, irresistible, which carry a plain reference to a supposable power exerted, endeavors used, resistance made in opposition to the necessity, and the persons that hear them not considering nor suspecting, but that they are used in their proper sense, that sense being therefore understood, there does naturally, and as it were necessarily, arise in their minds a supposition that it may be so indeed, that true desires and endeavors may take place, but that invincible necessity stands in the way and renders them vain and to no effect. Roman numeral number 5. Another thing which makes persons more ready to suppose it to be contrary to reason, that men should be exposed to the punishments threatened to sin for doing those things which are morally necessary, or not doing those things morally impossible, is that imagination strengthens the argument and adds greatly to the power and influence of the seeming reasons against it from the greatness of that punishment. to allow that they may be justly exposed to a small punishment would not be so difficult. Whereas, if there were any good reason in the case, if it were truly a dictate of reason that such necessity was inconsistent with faultiness or just punishment, the demonstration would be equally certain with respect to a small punishment, or any punishment at all, as a very great one. But it is not equally easy to the imagination. They that argue against the justice of damning men for those things that are thus necessary seem to make their argument the stronger by setting forth the greatness of the punishment in very strong expressions, in expressions such as these: that a man should be cast into eternal burnings, that he should be made to fry in hell to all eternity for those things which he had no power to avoid, and that was under a fatal, unfrustrable, invincible necessity of doing.